This is Kenny Tan. Welcome to Real Estate License in 14 Weeks. This is episode 13 of Starting from Zero. We continue with Chapter 3, Title Burdens and Protections. If you like my video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe, and remember to click the bell. That way you receive first notification of all new releases of my videos. We're going to talk about private and public restrictions. What is private restriction? Sometimes you buy a piece of property. There might have been previously recorded private restrictions that may affect the use of the property. Now, whether a private restriction is enforceable or not is another matter. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, let's say in the 1930s, if there was a restriction against the use of certain property, that has been recorded against the property. That's what we call a private restriction. A private restriction is enforceable just as long as it is not against public policy. For example, a private restriction that imposes the height of a building or the height of the trees you can have in your backyard, those are all private restrictions. There are some places where views is so important to the residents in the community. So there might have been private restriction that was recorded that restrict the height of the trees, for example, so that the tree does not block the view of the neighbors. However, if a private restriction has the effect of discriminating against certain type of people, such as a private restriction that says only white Caucasian may live here, suddenly that is racial discrimination, and that's not going to be enforceable. Even though back in the 1930s, it was perfectly okay to discriminate against somebody based on the color of the skin. Okay, but the private restriction might have been recorded years ago. But these days, even though it's not removed, it is not enforceable, so we don't really need to worry about it. But when we talk about private restriction, we also need to talk about CC&R. What is a CC&R? A CC&R is it's covenant, condition, and restriction. Okay. Now, covenant, condition, and restriction talks about the kind of private restrictions that can be imposed in a condominium project, for example. It's not limited to condominium project, but it is very common. It's pretty much mandatory in condominium project. There are two types of restrictions that will show up on the exam. One is called covenant, and one is called condition. What is a covenant? A covenant is a type of restriction that if you breach it, it's not going to cause you to lose title. For example, if you live in a condominium complex, it says here you can't park your car on the street. Okay, that is a private restriction. And it is a covenant. Because it is a covenant, if you violate it, it's still not going to cause you to lose title. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, 99.9% of all the restrictions in the CC&R are of the covenant nature, that if you breach it, you're not going to lose title to the property. Now, the other type of restriction is what we call condition. It is hard to imagine that you're going to find a restriction that if you breach it, you are going to lose title. The only thing that I can think of is, for example, if you live in a certain community where they have minimum age, like a 55 years old community. If you lie about your age or if you commit a fraud in getting into the community, you could lose title because you could be removed from the community. So that's about the only thing that comes close to being a condition. So just remember, covenant, if you breach it, you don't lose title. Condition, if you breach it, you lose title. So something is called condition, it has to do with loss of title. Covenant, you don't lose title. Okay. So those are the things that I wanted to discuss with you about private restriction. Private restriction has to do with the zoning laws. For exam purposes, Just remember the zoning is the exercise of police power. Okay? Police power are the two keywords. Now, if a property is zoned for residential, you can't use it for commercial, for example. I mean, can you imagine if you live in a neighborhood where it's all residential, your next door neighbor is zoned for something else? Certainly, if it's in the residential zone, you cannot build anything other than residential. That's what the zoning law is for. It's the exercise of police power, is to protect the health and safety and the public welfare of the general public. If you're the owner of a property, if you don't like the zoning for the general area, or if you're a developer, you want to develop a piece of property, but the zoning is not the right kind of zoning for you to build your development, you want to change your zoning, well, you have to apply for the rezoning. Rezoning is essentially a change of zoning. To what entity do you apply for the rezoning? You apply, you make a petition to the Planning Commission. Zoning change is only available if you have more than one parcel. Okay. Now, what is a Planning Commission? Planning Commission is the legislative body that governs any zoning change, and usually the Planning Commission will consist of designers and local residents. You know, usually it's an odd number, like 5, 7, 9, okay, that consists of the planning commissioners. Now, what if you want to make a change regarding just a particular property? Say, for example, a residential lot may have a 5-foot setback on the side. The setback is the distance between the side of the building to the property line. That's what we call setback. Now, let's say, for example, you want to build something like adding a kitchen or adding something in your backyard, but you have to be less than 5 feet from the property line. The wall of the building has to be less than 5 feet. Well, in order to deviate from the 5 feet setback, for example, you would apply for what we call a variance. A variance is for a single parcel. A rezoning is for multiple parcels. Quickly on zoning symbols. R1 stands for single family residence. M1 has to do with manufacturing. In exam, you will not be tested on the zoning symbols. Just understand that there are many different, there are several zoning symbols. A stands for agriculture, C for commercial, okay? Now let's talk about downzoning. What is downzoning? Downzoning is an exam question, so you got to remember that one. Downzoning is basically a change of zoning from a more liberal use to a more restrictive use. That's what downzoning means. If there is a conflict between deed restriction and zoning law, it is the stricter of the two that controls. So whichever is a stricter restriction, that restriction will control. What is an encroachment? Well, in football terms, if a player is in a certain zone where he's not supposed to be in, we call that encroachment. Well, likewise, if your neighbor property extends toward beyond your property line, say, for example, your neighbors have part of its building over your property line, that's an encroachment. So whenever there's an encroachment, the property owner whose property is being encroached on has 3 years. This is an exam question, 3 years. We call that statute of limitation, 3 years statute of limitation to sue the next door neighbor who encroaches on his property. Now, if a person whose property is being encroached on does not take action against the person who encroached on his property, he runs the risk of the other person getting a prescriptive easement over his property. What that means is, after a certain period of time, the owner whose property is being encroached on loses the right to correct the problem. That's what we call prescriptive easement. I will briefly talk about homestead. What is homestead? Homestead is what the law gives you to protect the loss of equity, the loss of your home due to the fact that you owe debt to certain people. Now, homestead will protect against unsecured debt. However, homestead does not protect against secured debt. What is a homestead? I'll give you an example. You have a home, you own a home, you actually would have to live on that home. Now, if you have a homestead, a certain amount is set aside by the law. Assuming, I'll just assume a number. I'm sure we can verify what the exact amount number is. Let's say your homestead amount is $125,000. Okay. Now, you owe the bank, and the property is worth, let's say, $1.125 million. Okay. Now, you owe the bank $1 million, and your homestead is $125,000. And then you owe a credit card debt of $50,000. So the credit card company sues you in court, get a judgment, and record a judgment lien against your property. Now, the only reason why the credit card company cannot do an execution sale for your property because you have a homestead protection. Let's assume that the amount is $125,000. In order for the credit card company to force the sale of your property, your property value would have to be greater than, your equity would have to be greater than $125,000 because you have a homestead protection $125,000. Let's say, for example, your property is worth $1.5 million and you owe the credit card company $50,000. So 1.5 minus the homestead amount is, so you still have about $375,000 in your equity because 1.5 minus 125,000 is 375,000 because 375,000 is greater than the $50,000 debt that you owe the credit card company. In that situation, the credit card company can actually do an execution sale on your against your property. But if your property is only worth $900,000 and you owe the bank $1 million, there's just no way the credit card company can force the sale because the law will give you the homestead protection. That's what we mean by homestead protection. So remember, homestead protection only protects you against unsecured debt. The credit card company's debt is considered to be unsecured debt. But the mortgage loan that you have, the $1 million mortgage loan, that is a secured debt. Because when you got that loan, you agreed to allow the bank to record a secured lien against your property. That's why you cannot claim homestead against secured debt, but you can claim homestead against unsecured debt, like in a credit card debt. This is the end of episode 13. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.